The letter from my parents arrived on thick, embossed stationery the day after our courthouse wedding. It wasn't a congratulations, it was a financial eviction notice. By marrying outside the family's social and financial expectations, you have voluntarily voided your position as a beneficiary of the Kensington Trust, effective immediately. My new husband, Leo, with grease under his fingernails and a heart bigger than my father's portfolio, held me as I cried. "We don't need their money, Elena," he whispered. "We have us." 5 years later, we're pulling up the manicured drive of my childhood estate, not in our old sputtering sedan, but in a silent electric car that costs more than the annual gala budget. Leo isn't wearing coveralls, he's in a Tom Ford tuxedo, and we're not here for a reconciliation, we're here to foreclose. Because the humble mechanic they scorned is Leo Thorne, the reclusive tech billionaire, and the anonymous investor who just bankrupted their precious charity is about to claim his favorite asset, their pride. I am Elena Kensington Thorne. The Kensington is a relic, a name that now tastes like old money and disapproval. The Thorne is my life, my truth, and their ultimate nightmare. A 25-year-old art history graduate who believed love was the only currency that mattered. Naive, soft, defined by family name and expectation. At 30, I run the largest philanthropic arts endowment in the state. My polish is no longer a veneer, it's tempered steel. I learned to wield social capital from my parents, but I learned integrity and strategy from Leo. My husband, Leo, to the world he's Leo Thorne, founder of Aether Systems, a billionaire who buys failing legacy companies and transforms them into sustainable, ethical powerhouses. To my parents, he was that mechanic with the loud motorcycle. His genius isn't just in engines or code, it's in seeing the broken systems in anything, including a rotting, arrogant family dynasty, and knowing exactly how to rebuild them. The letter wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed. For months, my calls to my mother went straight to voicemail. My father, when he finally deigned to speak, was chillingly clinical. "You made an emotional decision, Elena. Emotions are liabilities. The trust was structured to protect the family from liabilities." Leo and I lived in his one-bedroom apartment above the garage he then owned. The roar of engines being tuned was our soundtrack. I'd lie awake, the phantom weight of pearl necklaces and expectation heavy on my neck, listening to Leo's steady breathing. One night, after a particularly brutal dream of my mother's turned back, I found him at the small kitchen table, blueprints and circuit diagrams spread beside a legal pad. "What are you working on?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep. He looked up, his eyes fierce with protective love. "A future," he said simply. He slid the legal pad toward me. At the top, he'd written, "Operation Veritas." Below, a flowchart. On one side, Kensington Foundation, hollow, exploitative, a brand. Arrows pointed to a central box. Leverage point, their vanity. On the other, our initiative, real, transformative, silent. The arrows converged on a final, bolded word, justice. "I won't let them break you," he said, his voice low, "and I won't let them keep breaking everyone else with their pretty, empty charity. We're going to build something real, and then we're going to use what they value most, their status, their property, to show them how empty it all is." That was the night the plan stopped being a fantasy and became a blueprint. Our love was the foundation, but this was the architecture. Our 5-year plan was a masterpiece of dual existence. Publicly, Leo sold his chain of successful, eco-friendly garages and went into tech consulting, a conveniently vague title that explained our slowly improving lifestyle. Privately, Aether Systems was revolutionizing grid-scale battery storage, its valuation soaring. Every dollar was a brick in our invisible fortress. While my parents held galas for the Kensington Foundation for the Arts, events where the real art was the delicate ballet of social one-upmanship, I was my own secret agent. Using a pseudonym, I attended community board meetings, sat in cramped studios, and learned what real artists needed: consistent rent, materials grants, and exposure to audiences, not just wealthy patrons. The Veritas Initiative was born in those spaces. Leo provided the capital from his ventures, I provided the vision and the network, quietly funneling grants to the very programs my parents' foundation took credit for supporting, but actually starved. We watched as the Kensington Foundation would announce a $50,000 grant to the City Ballet, take a 30% administrative fee, and then deliver the rest in quarterly installments that always seemed to arrive late, keeping the organizations perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. The foundation's finances were a gilded house of cards. My father, believing his own myth of financial acumen, had leveraged the family estate to cover his own investment shortfalls years ago. The foundation's solvency relied on one major anonymous legacy investor who covered the annual deficit attracted by the Kensington meme. That investor was Leo. He'd begun buying the foundation's debt piece by piece through a labyrinth of blind trusts and offshore holdings. His lawyer, the formidable Miss Vance, had even drafted the original loan agreement my father signed without a second glance, so eager was he for the cash infusion. Buried in the dense legalese was Clause 7.3. A material breach would be triggered by any action that brings the foundation's public reputation into material disrepute as determined solely by the investor. The trap was set the moment they cashed the first check. We just needed to wait for them to spring it themselves. The collapse began not with a bang, but with a calculated series of pinpricks. Leo, through his network, encouraged several major donors to quietly shift their giving to other, more transparent charities. A key grant to the symphony fell through due to a budgetary reallocation orchestrated by one of our shell corporations. Then the community theater lost its space when the building was suddenly purchased by a benevolent LLC owned by Veritas, and the rent was raised for everyone except them. My mother, Vivian, the foundation's chair, was baffled. The ingratitude, she hissed over lunch at the club, a scene relayed to me by a still friendly former Deb. The market is simply down, darling, my father Charles assured her, nervously adjusting his cufflinks. He didn't know his personal stock portfolio was being systematically and legally shorted by Aether Systems' hedge fund arm, bleeding his liquid assets dry. Then came the masterstroke. Leo, through an intermediary, connected the Kensington Foundation with a seemingly prestigious and completely fabricated European arts collective for a joint exhibition. The foundation fronted the costs for shipping and insurance. A week before the opening, the collective vanished, and the priceless antiquities were revealed to be brilliant forgeries. The scandal was small but perfect, a splash of mud on the gleaming Kensington name. It was all Miss Vance needed. The letter from Atlas Holdings arrived by courier. It stated that due to the material breach of fiduciary responsibility and reputational damage caused by the forgery, the terms of the legacy investors' loans are being called in immediately. The foundation was insolvent. The only asset of equivalent value was the collateral, the Kensington estate. Panic, pure and undignified, ensued. My parents, too proud to appear ruined, decided to host one final desperate gala to find a savior, an evening to secure the future of the arts. The invitation, printed on the last of the heavy cream stock, arrived at our penthouse. Leo slid it across the breakfast table to me, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Ready to go home, darling?
The Kensington Ballroom was a masterpiece of fading glory. Crystal chandeliers glittered, but the light felt brittle. The champagne was flowing, but the laughter was too high, too tight. My parents stood by the grand marble fireplace, their smiles as stiff as the portraits of stern ancestors looking down from the walls. When we entered, a hush rippled through the crowd, not because they recognized us immediately, but because of the aura of unmistakable, quiet power that walked in with us. We were the only people in the room who didn't look like we were trying. I saw the exact moment my mother registered my face. Her champagne flute wavered, liquid sloshing onto her Valentino gown. My father's eyes darted from my Yves Saint Laurent gown, a one-of-a-kind piece Leo had commissioned, to Leo's confident, unfamiliar bearing, the cut of his tuxedo speaking of bespoke mastery, not rental desperation. "Elena," my mother breathed, the word fragile thing. "Mother, father," I said, my voice clear and carrying. "You remember my husband, Leo." My father recovered first, his patrician mask snapping back into place, though it didn't reach his cold, confused eyes. "Elena, I see you've landed on your feet. Mr. Thorne, was it? In investments now. I hope it's more stable than automotive repair." Leo's smile was a tranquil, deep-water thing. Something like that. I specialize in restructuring. I have a keen interest in legacy assets and in correcting systemic failures. Before my father could process the threat, the head of the gala's organizing committee tapped a mic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your generosity tonight. We face a challenging moment, but the arts are resilient. We are honored to have with us the representative from Atlas Holdings, who holds the foundation's notes. She has a proposal for a path forward. A side door opened. Miss Vance entered, a vision in severe black, carrying a leather portfolio. She walked not to the stage, but directly to my parents, her heels clicking a decisive rhythm on the parquet floor. "Mr. and Mrs. Kensington," she said, her voice cool and professional, cutting through the murmur. "Per the agreed terms of the loan agreements dated June 14th, 2021, and following the material default event of April 12th, Atlas Holdings is exercising its right to seize the pledged collateral. The titles for the primary estate, the Hampton House, and the Napa Vineyard have been legally transferred as of 5 p.m. today." The color drained from my father's face, leaving him the shade of old parchment. "This is an outrage, a predatory scheme. I'll fight this in every court in the land." Miss Vance didn't blink. "You personally signed the agreements, Mr. Kensington. The arbitration clause is ironclad. You waived all standard rights to litigation. You have no legal grounds. However," she paused, letting the word hang, "my client is a pragmatic man. He is prepared to offer a settlement tonight, a clean break. Sign over all remaining foundation assets and dissolve the entity, and he will forego pursuing your personal guarantees for the remaining debt." "Who is your client?" my father demanded, his voice cracking with a fury born of terror. "I demand to see him." Leo stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the small of my back. "I am." The two words dropped like stones in the suddenly silent room. You could hear the ice melting in a distant glass. My mother made a small, wounded animal sound, her hand fluttering to her throat. My mechanic?" my father whispered, the world unraveling thread by thread before him. "Your son-in-law," Leo corrected, his tone gentle as a surgeon's first cut. "You cut Elena off for marrying beneath her. You were right. I was far above you. You just couldn't see it. You valued the brand, the appearance, the social ledger. I value systems that work, art that matters, and people who keep their promises." He gestured to a small prepared table by the window where another associate stood ready with documents. "We can sign the dissolution papers now. The foundation's remaining funds will be distributed to its actual creditors, the community artists and institutions you've been exploiting for years. The Veritas Initiative will absorb its remaining obligations in perpetuity." All eyes turned to me. This was my moment. I addressed the stunned room of their peers, my voice steady, echoing in the cavernous space. "For years, this foundation has used the arts as a backdrop for a social event. The Veritas Initiative believes the art is the event. The party is over, but the real work of supporting the arts, of paying artists, funding studios, filling theaters with people who can't afford a $5,000 plate, is just beginning. For anyone interested in philanthropy that actually reaches the canvas, not just the caterer, my team is in the lobby." We didn't stay for the signing. We turned and walked out, leaving them in the ruins of their ballroom as Miss Vance presided over the humiliating paperwork, as the glittering crowd began to buzz and shift, many already drifting toward the lobby to find my team. In the car, the silence was warm, filled with the soft hum of the engine. Leo took my hand, his thumb tracing over my knuckles. "You okay?" I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion, a place that had always felt like a beautifully appointed museum where I was the most fragile, carefully curated exhibit. I felt no triumph, only a vast and profound relief. "I'm free," I said, and I meant it. The next day, the society blogs and financial papers exploded with the Kensington transfer. The narrative was irresistible, the scorned heiress and the mechanic-turned-billionaire who toppled a dynasty. My parents, stripped of their properties and pillars of identity, retreated to a modest apartment in a good but not great building bought with the last sliver of their unprotected funds. Charles was forced to take a consulting role at a firm owned by an old rival. Vivian found her social calls abruptly unreturned. The Veritas Initiative, with me as its very public face, launched with a $1 billion endowment from Aether Systems. Our first act was to pay out every outstanding grant the Kensington Foundation had promised, in full within the week. Our second was to establish a permanent, affordable artists' housing complex in the city's core. We named it the Kensington Arts Residency, a final, philanthropic twist of the knife that ensured their name would be remembered, but forever associated with our work. Sometimes my mother calls. The conversations are short, strained with a new, bitter respect. She speaks of the weather or a newspaper article she read about us. She never apologizes. She never asks for anything. But the subtext is always there, a stunned acknowledgement that the world has been permanently reordered. They see our names now, not in the society pages, but in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, realms of power they admired but could never truly access. Last week, Leo and I walked through the Kensington Estate Gardens, now the headquarters of Veritas. The manicured hedges were being replanted with native species and sculpture installations. In my old bedroom, now a bright conference room, a community group was planning a public mural project. Leo wrapped his arms around me as we looked out over the land. "What do you see?" he asked. "I see potential," I said, leaning back into him. "I see a foundation that's actually built on one. The trust fund was a trap they set for me, a leash of gold and conditional love. They never imagined I'd marry the man who would quietly, patiently, legally come to own the very land the trap was built on. They tried to teach me a harsh lesson about value and consequence. In the end, we taught them one. The true measure of worth isn't what you're born into, but what you build, and who you build it with. Their legacy was a facade. Ours is a living, breathing institution, and unlike theirs, it is built on bedrock."